Hi, thank you for joining us today. My name is Erin Trish, and I am the co-director of the USC Leonard D. Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics, and also an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical and Health Economics at the USC School of Pharmacy. Our webinar today will be focused on medical device regulation and reimbursement, and in particular, what the pandemic revealed about this important area. We'll talk today about the challenges and opportunities facing the FDA and CMS in an age of breakthrough medical devices. This webinar is hosted by the USC Schaeffer Center as part of the Richard N. Merkin, MD Distinguished Speaker Series. We're honored to have with us today two very distinguished guests, Dr. Scott Gottlieb and Joe Grogan. The program will start with with brief remarks from each of our two panelists, followed by a question and answer session. And audience members can submit questions through the Q&A function at any time, and we'll get to those later in the webinar. I want to start with some brief introductions, though they have many accolades. I'll try to summarize briefly so we can get to the meat of the discussion today. First, we have with us Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb was the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration from 2017 to 2019. And during his time at the FDA, he focused on a variety of issues, including drug approvals, medical product innovation, food safety, vaccination, and tobacco and vaping, among others. He's now a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he continues to work on improving public health through entrepreneurship and medical innovation, and on expanding regulatory approaches to maintain patient and physician autonomy. He's also the author of a New York Times bestselling book, Uncontrolled Spread, which I'd recommend highly that you all pick up and read. It's a fascinating, tells the fascinating story of why the American healthcare system was overwhelmed in the face of the COVID pandemic, due in part to regulatory failures and structural reimbursement problems that we'll talk about today. We also have with us Joe Grogan, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Schaeffer Center. Joe offers a very unique blend of public and private sector experience. In addition to positions working at Amgen and Gilead Sciences throughout his career, he's also had a number of high-profile jobs in the federal government. During the George W. Bush administration, he served as the executive director of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, and as a special assistant to Commissioner Andy von Eschenbach, where he first worked with Dr. Gottlieb. During the Trump administration, he worked as the associate director of health programs at the Office of Management and Budget, before moving to the West Wing as domestic policy advisor, where he was one of the founding members of the president's COVID-19 task force. And as Scott details in his book, Joe was one of the earliest voices to raise alarm in the White House about COVID-19. So thank you both very much for being here with us today. I'll turn it over first to some brief remarks from Dr. Gottlieb, and then we will turn it over to Joe.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here today. I think what the COVID pandemic revealed, and I just want to start there, is how important medical devices and diagnostics in particular are to a response to a pandemic. I think we underestimated how important diagnostic tests would be in the setting of a pandemic with a novel virus, because we always plan for a pandemic involving influenza. In the setting of influenza, access to widespread diagnostic testing is typically less important because the incubation period for flu is very short. People aren't typically contagious until they manifest symptoms. And the nation's installed base of flu testing would be adequate in the setting of a pandemic involving flu. If you knew that the pandemic strain was an influenza A, you could use the installed base of diagnostic tests in any doctor's office to differentiate influenza A or influenza B, which would be sufficient for diagnosing the pandemic strain, since that would be the prevalent strain that was circulating. So when we did all that, our pandemic planning, we never really prioritized the ability to develop and scale diagnostic testing and open up collection sites. It was never really contemplated that we would need to invest in that. And yet in the setting of this novel coronavirus, diagnostic testing became a critical factor and really caused a lot of our early setbacks. I would argue a lot of our problems for the duration of this pandemic really stemmed from our inability to have diagnostic tests at the outset. Not only did we become heavily seeded with virus early on, but we didn't know where the virus wasn't. And so when we had to reach for population-wide mitigation in order to stem the spread of the virus, rather than do that on a targeted basis in cities where the virus was spreading, we did it on a national level, even though we now know in retrospect that the virus wasn't spreading across all parts of the country. There were many parts of the country during that early wave that were largely unaffected with the virus. And so by the time it got to those parts of the country, every place had already shut down, and there was a lot of political resistance to shutting down again. So we had used up the political capital early and shut down the entire country with the 15 days to slow the spread, followed by another 30 days to slow the spread, a full 45-day shutdown of non-essential business activity. But we didn't have to do that across the whole country. There were clearly parts of the country where the virus hadn't spread to. And so it was the inability to scale the development and deployment of diagnostic tests that was really at the root of a lot of our challenges with this coronavirus. And it was largely a failure of the ability of the federal government to engage private industry early enough and do a handoff to private sector medical device manufacturers and get them into the game at the outset of this so that they would have diagnostic tests available in large quantities by the time the virus arrived in sufficient numbers here in the United States. That decision needed to be made sometime in January, probably. It takes 4 to 6 weeks, even if you crash the development of a diagnostic test. Those phone calls didn't get made, as I talk about in the book, until really February. We didn't get the private industry engaged. And by then it was largely too late. And so I think that, thinking about what went wrong, we never really envisioned how important medical devices, and particularly diagnostic tests, would be to a pandemic response, and never had really prepared for that contingency, how you engage private industry early, how you fund it. There was no mechanism in place to do that. There was no guaranteed purchase in place. There was no mechanism to put a guaranteed purchase in place. So that really set us back. I think a lot of the emphasis in the past had been on how to scale the production of a vaccine, even though we didn't really have sufficient capacity to do that. There was almost a monocular focus on how to develop a vaccine in the setting of a pandemic, and very little attention given to other components of the response, like how to scale the manufacturing of antibody-based drugs, which we knew would be probably the first therapeutics available in the setting of a pandemic and could serve as a bridge to a vaccine. And certainly no real planning on how to scale the development and deployment of diagnostic tests in the setting of a pandemic. And in many ways, we didn't even have preparations for scaling the manufacturing of vaccines. Had we had to rely on protein-based vaccines or even recombinant vaccines, we probably would never have had a sufficient supply. It was only because we relied on mRNA technology and viral vector vaccines as developed by J&J that we were able to scale the production of these vaccines, because we were able to produce very large quantities of vaccines on relatively small manufacturing platforms. But if we had been dependent upon growing up cell cultures in large vats or recombinant vaccines in large cell cultures, we wouldn't have had the available capacity to do that. So in some respects, we got lucky that we were able to rely on fully synthetic tools to manufacture the vaccines. That's really the only reason we were able to have the vast supply that we had. So I think going forward, we're going to have to pay much more attention to the full range of sort of therapeutic options in terms of mounting a counterattack to a future pandemic strain. And diagnostic tests and medical devices are going to be a real key part of that. How we build extra capacity into the system to scale testing, scale collection, how we guarantee the supply chain for diagnostic testing, and how we do a quicker handoff to private industry, which has the ability to produce a diagnostic test at a scale that's sufficient to deal with a pandemic. So we're going to have to think differently and about how we prepare for the future. And diagnostic tests, medical devices are going to be a key part of that.
Thank you very much. You covered a lot of great topics there. I'll turn it over to Joe for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Erin, and thank you, Scott, for joining us. I think, obviously I agree with everything Scott just said. One thing I'd point out is, for people who spend most of their time in drug regulation, the drug industry, there might be a initial take that device regulation is similar. And on the FDA side, it's relatively similar. Somebody who understands how FDA regulates drugs can relatively quickly decipher with some study how the Center for Drugs and Radiological Health review devices and diagnostics. But on the reimbursement side, it really is a totally different animal. The only thing that's really similar is the fact that it's administered by CMS, just like the drug side. But as on the drug side, you've got Part B, you've got Part D, which everybody who spends any time in the industry understands. On the device side, you've got 3 distinct processes to get something covered. You've got coverage, coding, and reimbursement. And when you get a drug approved, you're basically on the market. FDA approves a drug, you're out there There could be some delays, some things working through the system, but not typically does a patient who really needs a drug after FDA approval are they not able to access it? Not so on the drug on the device side and with diagnostics. You frequently, it takes multiple years through several different bureaucratic agencies at CMS, a whole different clinical trial paradigm to prove to CMS that your device or diagnostic is appropriate for the Medicare population. And private industry keys off of Medicare for figuring out what to cover or not. And you have this tremendous disparity in reimbursement as well, which crimps investment in this area. If you think about a diagnostic like Foundation One that's got dozens and dozens of biomarkers for the targeting of an oncology product, the oncology product goes for $100,000 for a course of treatment. The test is reimbursed at about $3,500. And they both have relatively similar delays in getting regulatory approval on the expense and getting clinical trials done. I mean, it takes that long. The diagnostic actually to have certain biomarkers validated could be significantly longer. All this is to say that, as Scott details in his book, we lacked the device prioritization and infrastructure to draw upon and pull up to the federal government to deploy to face the pandemic. He's absolutely right about the assumptions about flu. But beyond that, once we started to invest in warp speed for increased manufacturing and distribution, one irony is we basically governmentalized distribution, but there's a very robust drug distribution program in the United States commercially already. I mean, we could have taken the vaccines and given it to AmerisourceBergen and Cardinal and McKesson and said, go have at it, and we'll backfill with public health agencies on an as-needed basis. And a lot of people would have gotten vaccinated. But on the device side, still, it's difficult to this day to get a diagnostic in many areas. They're short and drugstore shelves. And just now, this week, the administration announced a new NIH prequalification process. So I say all this to go back to Scott's kicking off point, which is we didn't have the infrastructure for years of not prioritizing diagnostics. We didn't have that infrastructure to draw upon and get to scale the way we did with vaccines.
Thank you so much. It's a very helpful overview to both of you, and thank you for bringing it back. So I want to, start off with some of the issues that you raised. I think, many of us remember thinking back to the first few months of the pandemic, ourselves or our friends and family who had symptoms and wanted to get tested but didn't have access to it. And you described some of the kind of lack of partnership with the private industry and the lack of infrastructure to do this. But, I think there were some other kind of key regulatory issues that were involved in the lack of access or ability for patients to access those types of therapeutics. So Scott, in your book, you describe, some of the missteps that occurred at the CDC in the initial days or months or weeks of the pandemic. But what did you see also as the kind of key regulatory issues that were involved in the kind of difficulty with bringing diagnostics to market?
Yeah, look, there was a challenge with getting laboratory developed tests into the game. There was a challenge with getting at-home testing available to patients, a swabbable stick that could give a readable result in a patient's home. I mean, FDA really transformed itself in terms of how it thinks about diagnostic tests that patients can use in their homes to self-diagnose. Previously, it was sort of taboo, the idea that you would make a diagnostic test available to a patient to allow them to self-diagnose for an infectious disease or especially a reportable pathogen in the confines of their own home with no requirement that the result get reported. Now you're seeing FDA do a wholesale embrace of that concept. And so it's really been sort of a 360 on the part of the agency. And this is going to, I think, have benefits across the continuum. You're going to see at-home testing become a much more vast category. I would expect to see at-home tests for all kinds of infectious diseases now made available to patients so they could self-diagnose in the home. And, coupled with telemedicine, I think that it's going to change the practice of medicine where you could sort of self-swab for the flu at home and maybe send off a confirmatory test at the same time. and couple it with a telemedicine visit and, get treated at the same time you get diagnosed without leaving your home. So I think you're going to see these become much more widespread. CDC really was an impediment early on. CDC, in order for manufacturers to design their own test, they needed access to viral samples. CDC wouldn't make the viral samples available really until the end of February is when they started to make them available to manufacturers. So they were largely frozen out of the market. Some manufacturers I know ended up getting viral samples from subsidiaries they had overseas, but a lot of them couldn't get them. And then if manufacturers couldn't design their own tests and wanted to copy the CDC's design, CDC was forcing them to license the design from CDC and sign pretty detailed IP agreements with the agency, promising that they wouldn't assert their intellectual property around the tests that they were marketing, which ended up being very onerous and complicated. So I talked to a lot of manufacturers over this time period, and they just decided to wait. They said to themselves and said to me, look, CDC says they have this, they have the ball here. They've made a commitment to flood the market with diagnostic tests, a commitment they were never able to fulfill. And they're making it very hard for us to get into the market. So we'll wait and see. And so it was CDC that created a lot of impediments to diagnostic manufacturers getting into the market. And I think that at the end of the day, CDC really needs to be removed from this task. They sort of jealously guard and husband their perceived authority over deploying a diagnostic test for a novel pathogen to sort of the detriment of getting capacity into the market. And I think that CDC in particular is very skeptical of getting the private industry engaged and doesn't work well with the private industry. And to the extent that they really had the lead here, that created a big impediment because CDC culturally doesn't work with the private industry and certainly doesn't work well with the private industry. They have no mechanism in place to contract for this. And when the FDA ultimately tried to prod CDC to work with a contract manufacturer, the agency was very resistant. FDA, and I detail this in the book, FDA sort of went forward on their own to work with a contract manufacturer and then ultimately forced the CDC to cooperate. And that's ultimately why we had as much diagnostic testing in March as we were able to muster. It wasn't the CDC that ultimately figured out how to manufacture their test. It was a contract manufacturer that entered the market with the assistance of FDA that was able to flood the market with primer and probe kits that were able to be used by labs to fill the testing void.
Interesting. Thank you for that perspective. So, Joe, at that time, you were working in the White House and leading many of the efforts in this regard. And I think once there were tests authorized by the FDA, we remember rose garden ceremonies and other things kind of championing the advent of these tests, but it still was difficult for patients to actually access them. So from your perspective and the kind of insider's perspective, what was going on in addition to the things that Scott was just describing?
Well, Scott, to be perfectly frank, Scott lays out a lot of details that I was completely unaware of at the time and would have been unaware of had I not read his book. It's very difficult to unpack what's going on in the recesses of a lot of these bureaucracies, in real time and in the middle of a pandemic. I think it is well understood the problems at CDC and then FDA and getting private companies on the market. But once they were on the market, I do think, and as you were starting to see those rose garden ceremonies in March and April, there was, I think, a false hope that the companies would be able to deploy these quickly and nationally, and there would be a lot of tests going on. And I remember even, weeks and weeks later, there was some befuddlement upon the medical team. Why are people not getting tests? Why are governors calling irate, saying that there's no testing available in their state when we know this company has this machine with a profound amount of throughput capability and they're approved by FDA? What's going on? And, one thing that came, I think it first and foremost goes to the fact how difficult it is for people who don't understand this ecosystem to unpack it and decipher what exactly was going on. And then there was an assessment that they weren't getting reimbursed enough, that the PPE was too PPE intensive, that the techs were too expensive to run the tests, that there was high throughput that needed a number of different samples to be run at the same time. And the reimbursement rate at that, if memory serves, I think it was around $30 and $50 for a COVID-19 test that had been set by CMS. CMS cranked it up to about $100 after a lot of debate. And to be perfectly frank, I think they were scrambling to try and figure out a rational peg of what to get it to. There were discussions of who cares, make it $200, let's make it $500. As long as we're incentivizing people to run tests, let's do it, because we were so underwater on testing. Ultimately, in the waning days of the Trump administration, they went to an adjustment from the $100 to $100 minus 25 if your test results weren't available. Because what is the point of getting a test if you're going to find out days later that you're positive and negative with a pathogen this virulent? So there was a real ignorance, I think, as far as information coming up into the task force and into the agencies about how this diagnostic system was working out there in the world. And to be honest with you, the private industry also began to bolt things together with, cellular networks to transmit results more quickly to home offices and get things reported. And the interface between CDC, local public health institutions, and private industry was very rickety. It remains rickety to this day. Those systems are not well set up at all. So it goes back to this concept that Scott lays out very well, that we didn't have the infrastructure, and we haven't invested in this ecosystem. We don't have pre-deployed testing capability all around the country that we can flip a switch and activate.
Thank you. So you both have spoken about the kind of interaction or ability or importance of incentivizing engagement with the private sector. So Scott, thinking about, in contrast to the kind of issues or challenges that we faced on the diagnostic side, you can contrast that with what was really a remarkable speed and kind of vaccine product that we were able to develop and bring to market so quickly. What do you think was different about the two kind of different approaches, or what lessons can we learn from the success of the vaccine compared with some of the difficulties faced in the diagnostics?
Well, look, what did we really get with the vaccines? We got Moderna, we got Pfizer, and we got J&J, although J&J, struggled at the outset to provide sufficient supply, in large part because they relied on the emergent facility, which wasn't kept in good shape. That was supposed to be the facility that we were maintaining as a hedge against the pandemic. And we found out the hard way that when you build a facility and largely mothball it, it's not going to be ready. You have to keep these things hot. You can't just keep a warm base. You got to keep a hot base. You got to keep these facilities operating. And so we need to think differently about how we build capacities in the future. But, Operation Warp Speed put extraordinary resources into Moderna to scale out that manufacturing and conduct the clinical trials for that company. Pfizer, which I'm on the board of, largely didn't participate in Operation Warp Speed. We ran our own clinical trials. We allocated about $2 billion in capital before we knew if the vaccine was going to work to build out the manufacturing facilities, on a presumption that if we had taken the government money and involved the government in running the clinical trials and the manufacturing, it would slow us down. And so the company made a decision. It wasn't capital constrained, obviously. So it made a decision to spend its own capital to do that. So what did we really get? I mean, the other vaccines haven't succeeded so far. Novavax hopefully will get over the finish line soon. Sanofi has reformulated their vaccine. Merck didn't have success with their vaccine. They're going to be manufacturing the J&J vaccine. So, we got 3 vaccines, only 2 of which we were able to supply in large enough quantities. And the reason why we were able to do that was largely because of the tools we use. We were able to pivot to these fully synthetic tools, a complete paradigm change in the manufacture of vaccines. Again, if we had been dependent upon protein-based vaccines, we wouldn't have had the available capacity, just like we didn't have the capacity to manufacture the antibodies at scale. It's to some degree the same kinds of manufacturing facilities, and we just didn't have excess capacity to manufacture biological drugs in vats. We didn't have the facilities available. And so just like we didn't have enough antibody drugs at any point in this pandemic, we wouldn't have had the enormous capacity to develop billions of doses of vaccines if we were dependent upon old processes to do that. It was because we had the mRNA technology. It was able to be manufactured in different kinds of platforms that had extremely high yield. And J&J's vaccine has extremely high yield as well. The company spent years working on that vaccine. And with very small amounts of manufacturing capacity, you can get a tremendous amount of yield with that vaccine. It was specifically engineered to do that. So we got lucky with the technology. But if we hadn't been able to use the mRNA technology against COVID, and we were dependent upon protein-based vaccines, we wouldn't have had the success that we had in supplying the U.S. and the globe with vaccines. And so I think we got lucky. I don't think that this was by deliberate design, because if you look at the vaccines that ultimately succeeded, it was the mRNA technology, and everything else didn't work. The other vaccines didn't make it over the finish line. Eventually, some may, but out of the pandemic phase, I mean, it was really the mRNA vaccines that got us through the pandemic phase of this.
Great, thank you. So I think, you both have touched on the kind of value of getting new therapies or new diagnostics or new treatments to patients quickly. And that's, quite obvious during a pandemic why we see such value there. But, switching gears a bit, I think there is a lot of value to getting new therapies or diagnostics to patients with unmet need, even beyond the pandemic setting. So, Joe, you recently, you did a nice job at the beginning of laying out the differences between reimbursement for devices and how that differs from the drug reimbursement or coverage pathways. But ultimately, you recently wrote a blog post that described one of the rules that was moved forward under the Trump administration during your time there that was really pushing to accelerate coverage for innovative technologies for Medicare, the MCIT rule. That was moved forward and finalized during the Trump administration, but recently pulled back under the Biden administration out of raising some concerns. So can you describe kind of what were the goals, or what were you trying to achieve with that policy, and what are some of the reasons why the Biden administration is concerned with it today?
Well, what we were trying to do is get innovative technologies out to the marketplace as quickly as possible. So it's called the Medicare Coverage and Innovative Technologies Rule. And basically it laid out that if FDA designates a device as breakthrough and then approves it, it would automatically be covered on the CMS side. Not every device, not every diagnostic, a small subset that was determined to be breakthrough would be covered. And that would short circuit some of the bureaucratic hurdles that CMS erects to getting these out into the marketplace to the Medicare population. You would still have to figure out how much this product would get reimbursed for and go through, but that whole coverage, reasonable and necessary standard, which is different than safe and effective at FDA, would be dispensed with. Frequently, CMS raises objections about various devices and says they have to run their own trials and look at their own data, and saying, oh, this isn't suitable for the Medicare population. The population that FDA looked at was not representative of Medicare. It's something certainly that device companies, diagnostic companies need to look at when they're designing their trials and figuring out, hey, is this going to be suitable for CMS, or am I going to have to do a whole new series of trials after FDA review? And so I think the reason why the Biden administration didn't like this, and it was controversial, and Peter Bach wrote a big long hit piece about this, that this was going to be opening the floodgates to dangerous products getting into the market and all this stuff, which I categorically disagree with. I mean, FDA, I have faith in the FDA to approve it. On the CMS side, I fail to see why you can't allow the marketplace to decide what is suitable or not once FDA decides that it's safe and effective. And frankly, the Biden administration wanted CMS to have more control over these products. We were more sympathetic to innovation in and of itself and letting the market decide. I'm hopeful that in the end, if the Biden administration doesn't finalize some version of this, that Congress will step in It's a provision, a similar provision is included in the Cures 2.0 bill, which may go in the spring. And that I think would be great for patients, but we were a deregulatory administration, we were a deregulatory team, and cutting out that level of review was important to us. The last thing I'd say about that too is the CMS staff who reviews these products at the various stages of coverage, coding, and reimbursement frequently speaks of being understaffed and not having the technical expertise to review them. So this is another, and finding people, frankly, who are technically sound to review complicated devices is a challenge at FDA. It's a challenge at CMS. People like this don't grow on trees, and they're very in demand in private industry. So having unnecessary barriers because the bureaucracy can't add qualified civil servants, we didn't think was reason to keep a product from patients.
Yeah, the genesis of this idea was actually FDA, and it came from the professional staff inside CDRH. And the initial discussions were directly with SEMA about this. She faced opposition initially inside CMS, not because I think they were philosophically opposed to it, but the CMS didn't like the idea, the professional staff there didn't like the idea of giving up their discretion by tying their coverage decisions to a decision made by FDA. So that, CMS would effectively be forced to cover something just because FDA gave it a breakthrough designation, and that would take their discretion away. No agency likes to lose discretion. And so the way we tried to solve for that was by giving CMS, more of a seat at the table and how the breakthrough designations were determined as well. And that seemed to get us there. SEMA was ultimately able to move this through her own agency. The elegance of it was that not only was it sort of a presumption of coverage, but that presumption of coverage was going to be worth a lot of money in terms of, for almost no cost, you were going to be able to finance this innovation much more easily. So if a new breakthrough device got a breakthrough designation, and there was a presumption that it was going to be covered on the back end if it was successful, that was going to make it much easier to raise venture capital and get it financed in the private markets. And so really for no cost to the federal government, all of a sudden they were going to create a lot of fiat investment just by virtue of conferring a status on something. And that's always kind of advantageous. You don't have to spend any money, but you can help promote a lot more capital formation. That was the elegance of it. My feeling is that the Biden administration's decision to pull it was just gratuitous politics. There were some Democratic interests against this, particularly among the payers, who thought it would force them to have to cover technologies that they otherwise would have been reluctant to cover, or been able to exercise more discretion about covering. And, they were pushing on the administration. And I think this was just an example of a new administration coming in and unraveling a policy from the old administration. I don't think that there was sort of based on what I've not heard, any kind of like philosophical, really hard feelings about this. I think this was the kind of thing, the kind of gratuitous policymaking you sometimes see when administrations change over. So I agree with Joe. I think that this could be done legislatively. I don't think that there is a whole lot of opposition to it. The bureaucracy could be solved for their angst. I think the payers, this really isn't going to be a big hit to the payers. The reality is most of these breakthrough products are going to get covered anyway. I mean, the vast majority of them are going to get paid for. It's just a question of how quickly they'll be paid for. So it's hard to envision. There was some estimates on how much money this is going to cost. There's always seemed to be inflated to me, because most of these technologies will in fact get covered because they are breakthrough medical technologies that are transformative from a healthcare standpoint.
I see. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for submitting questions. I'll remind you, continue to submit them through the Q&A function. Great questions coming through. But to build on that, I think that that's a very helpful and insightful kind of landscape of what's going on. I think it touches on some of the issues too that you seem to really focus on during your time at FDA, Scott, about the building and development of the use of real world evidence, right? The time we kind of know the least about how a new product or a new drug is going to work in the real world is at launch. And we want to see kind of how the safety and efficacy unfolds when patients are using this actually in practice, not just in trials. You talk about some of the experience with this in your book about kind of how you shared risks and uncertainty with patients, and kind of how that empowered them to make decisions and to kind of understand what we knew and didn't know. But can you talk a bit about what you learned from that experience and how we can think about building on that to kind of improve the health system moving forward?
Well, look, with respect to this kind of a policy where you're tying coverage to the designation, the breakthrough therapy designation, I think it's going to come hand in hand with some kind of post-market evidence collection. That was always a presumption in the scheme, and to collect that evidence in the real world, I think you're going to be relying on more registries and real world kind of evidence, as you do often in the medical device space, much more so than you do in the drug space, where you typically want randomized data. I think in the medical device space is much more of a ready embrace to using real world evidence to answer post-market questions.
Thank you. And I think, this really speaks to the kind of expectation you noted, Scott, some comments about the investment in innovation. I think tying this back to some of the experiences of the pandemic, that was a time when we, used or considered using these guaranteed purchasing mechanisms for the, advancement or development of novel therapies or diagnostics. I think, that's potentially something that can be deployed elsewhere. There are other instances where we want treatments to exist, but hopefully never to have to use them for other things like, antibiotic resistant, strains of microbes and things like that. Joe, do you have any thoughts on kind of what that experience was like and whether that's a policy mechanism to explore for the future?
Well, I do think that the marketplace is going to continue to evolve, and some of these diagnostics, there's the possibility, the hope, the optimism that some of these diagnostics will take more of a front, and the importance of diagnostics will take on more of a prominent role in directing care. I mean, there's a number of drugs that have been developed through various biomarkers and that are directed now through various diagnostics and biomarkers. If you get into a world where drugs are being, where payment is contingent upon their effectiveness, and you have value-based contracts, and you have to, the company makes $100,000. If it works, they make $100,000 minus X. If it doesn't work, you could potentially see where the the diagnostic manufacturers have a bit more leverage in bringing in capital and demanding higher prices for some of their treatments. And hopefully it will add more pressure upon CMS and, frankly, Congress to reform this area. Having spent a lot of time in this area, I can tell you, I don't think it can be tinkered with. I think it needs to be fundamentally rethought. If you use Scott's paradigm about how can you have a national infrastructure of diagnostics that can be relied upon at any time, what would it take to get there? I mean, that should be a bipartisan area of inquiry, to have high throughput and rapid at home, rapid office testing everywhere that could be repurposed, that could be infrastructure that could spin out new tests rapidly and quickly for people. And that public health infrastructure, just as we relied upon our drug industry to slide over and devote intellectual brain power, distribution, manufacturing capability. I mean, like Amgen, for instance, is manufacturing right now for Eli Lilly and some of their monoclonal antibodies. It's a tremendous story of collaboration. They're opening new plants in the United States. If you don't have that, if you do something unfortunate on the drug pricing side, and we have all these debates about drugs being overpaid in this country, I think there's a real question that should be asked from a public health perspective. What's the cost of underpaying? From my perspective, we underpay for devices. We don't prioritize getting them out to the marketplace. We don't prioritize getting diagnostics out to the marketplace. We've underinvested in this area. We don't prioritize bringing in private capital, and we paid the price for it in a big way. On the drug side, the big success of the pandemic response is Operation Warp Speed and Pfizer's ability to deploy their own capital to bring their vaccine to market. Look, I hate to break it to people, but Pfizer is a for-profit entity. They are huge, and thank God that they exist. If they didn't have that scale to do what they did, would they have been able to? Would we be where we are today? I'm not so sure that we would be. And so I'd like to see the debate turn from, oh, gee, we're overpaying for drugs, to one, what's the cost of underinvesting or underpaying for drugs? And two, what can we do to get our device infrastructure and diagnostic infrastructure up to the level that we'd like to see, and that, frankly, American patients and American citizens deserve?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think, to think back prior to the pandemic, there was a strong push for this kind of efficiency and cutting out the slack in the healthcare system, and really this motivation to drive down costs through kind of operating, at full capacity. And I think, Scott, you described some of the kind of issues with that mindset in a pandemic, in our ability to respond to these types of surges or other kind of needs to pivot. What can we learn from the pandemic experience about how we should think about the kind of resiliency and capacity of what we need in our healthcare system going forward?
Yeah, we're going to have to pay for not just maximal efficiency in manufacturing, but maximal resiliency. And that's going to mean, the government contracting with certain entities to have a call option on manufacturing capacity that could be needed in a pandemic. And that doesn't mean building out facilities and mothballing them. It means asking certain entities to create capacity that could be called away by the federal government in time of emergency. There's many different ways to fulfill that. You could overbuild a facility and just operate at partial capacity, and you're getting paid to, maintain some residual reserve capacity. You could freeze a lot of your bulk drug, and so that in a time of emergency, you could thaw out your drug product and turn over your facility to the federal government. You could freeze up to 2 or 3 years supply of your drug and basically be able to turn over your facility for a year to the federal government in a time of a crisis. But we're going to need to find ways to contract for that reserve capacity in the system to be able to be a hedge against an emergency.
Thank you. So realizing we're nearing the end of our time here, I want to give Joe you a chance to give some last thoughts about, then I'll turn it over to Scott. But if you could change, kind of building off what you've learned in all of your various experiences and from the pandemic, if you could change one thing about either FDA regulation or CMS coverage of diagnostics and devices, what would it be?
Well, I think the big transformation in drug regulation was clearly the Prescription Drug User Fee Act and all those other user fee acts that added resources to FDA, added technical expertise, and put the FDA on a clock, frankly, for reviewing these products. If you were to interject a similar type mechanism at CMS and force Congress to confront how do we really want to see devices reimbursed, diagnostics reimbursed, and have some type of user fee program on the device and diagnostic side with metrics for performance, I think that type of multi-year policy process, and it would take Congress a couple of years to really think this through and figure out how to do it with expert input. I think that could speed more devices and more diagnostics into the marketplace.
Great, thank you. And Scott, one last question for you. Do you think we'll be able to get it right in time for the next pandemic?
Depends on when the next pandemic is. I mean, we really haven't started a robust discussion about how to prepare better, and it's going to take years probably to get the right capacity and resiliency in place. And that discussion just hasn't begun yet. So I don't know that we have endless time here. The next pandemic's probably going to be a novel strain of influenza. You can argue that maybe we're more susceptible to it because we haven't put a lot of flu immunity in the population in the last couple of years. And so, I don't think that we have endless time to start preparing differently.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much to both of you for joining, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining as well. I'd also like to thank Dr. Richard Merkin for his support of this webinar series. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks a lot.